Good evening. Welcome to this lecture, which follows our AGM, which we had in the council room over there. It's a sort of, I wouldn't say it's a break from traditional subject matter for lectures hosted by the British Institute. Some years ago, the BIRIs, which is the British International Research Institutes, were requested by the British Academy, who largely funds them. The BIRIs are places like the British School at Rome, the British School at Athens, Ankara, Amman, and so on, to extend the range of their disciplinary reach, shall we say, from the more traditional areas of history and archaeology into other disciplines in the arts and social sciences. There was no suggestion which they should become involved in nuclear physics or anything like that. But at the same time, and we have at Ankara achieved that, and we were hearing just now from our director about the range of fellows that we have in Ankara in terms of Ottoman studies, Byzantine studies, and so forth, some cultural, some historical. But it's a great pleasure to go a little step further into the area of what I think is ethnomusicology, and to invite one of the members of our council, Professor Martin Stokes, who is King Edward Professor of Music at King's College London, to talk to us this evening on the theme of an Arabesk Triptych. Martin, thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here. There are many wonderful things to do at this time of year on a Friday evening in London, but you've chosen to be here, so I'm very grateful for that. Thank you, Scott, for gently pushing me or pulling me in the direction of this organization. I've been very happily connected with it for a couple of years now. I was initially a little worried about what somebody like me might have to contribute to such an august and distinguished bunch of people like you, and wondering about the gulf between this thing called archaeology and this thing called anthropology or ethnomusicology that I do. But with each passing month, with each passing year, my sense of how we might reach across this space grows and grows, and I'm very happy to be part of the kind of expansion of the field of activity of this lovely organization. When I was trying to think of what I was going to say, I came up with a title and an Arabesk Triptych, without having taken full cognizance of the fact that I'd be delivering it in this particular room with all of its art historical and pictorial wealth of a very magnificent kind, which contains plenty of food for thought about triptychs and frames. But I confess that wasn't actually part of my plan. I did, however, want to talk about my repetitive and compulsive and seemingly unstoppable urge to think about arabesque and to write about arabesque and to ask questions about arabesque, which I've been doing really for quite a long time now, since the mid-1980s. And that's the form that this short lecture is going to take. I've called it a triptych because I couldn't really think of another way of describing how the various different bits of it would actually fit together. They are loosely articulated, shall I say. And I want them to give a bit of a picture about how the fields of study that organize themselves around this particular object have shifted over the course of the last several decades. And of course, in part, it's a story about how I've changed, as well as how Turkey has changed, and as well as how arabesque has changed, and as well as how the academic field has changed. A moment of reflection was provided by an invitation in 2019 to participate in a film called itself The History of Turkish Arabesk Music, filmed by Al Jazeera World, and a director, actually a British-trained film director, a very interesting guy called Seyfettin Tokmak, which eventually came out in 2023. And if you want to find it, you can Google it and it comes up pretty quickly. In many ways, it told a familiar story. It told a story about how this popular music, very much associated with the transformations of the 1970s and the 1980s, had got a history that goes back to early Republican Turkey, if not late Ottoman world. A picture of this music in relation to a transforming cityscape, this music in relation to the emergence of new social classes, this music in relation to the changing mediascape of the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s. And a picture that seemed to always kind of elicit that seemed to be very much about eliciting the view of the intelligentsia, the kind of thinking classes, what they had to say about it, how they might interpret it, how they might deal with this rather ephemeral kitsch, kind of low-value music, and kind of make it available for sort of sociological contemplation of a particular kind. What was interesting about this particular, or what became interesting to me, was how I began to play a role in this hour-long film, as opposed to just being a talking head. And Seyfettin Tokmak seemed to be very interested in capturing pictures of me wandering around the city and looking at it with deeply meaningful glances, reminiscent, I suppose, of the Ottoman flaneur of the late 19th century. So this kind of gaze at the quote-unquote the foreign researcher who had stumbled on this strange topic of research seemed to be a matter of interest. And that got me thinking. At the very least, I thought what I would do would be to start documenting their looking at me, as it were, because I thought this would make a rather interesting kind of anthropological kind of space to be thinking about. So I found myself with this lovely film crew just before the pandemic, back in 2019, wandering the streets of Balat, getting in and out of dolmushes, sitting in cafes, and contributing to this picture of a music of working class recreational spaces, a cafe here in Balat, underground, I suppose, literally, a kind of glance on or a gaze upon the music of marginal people in some shape or form. This is, I think, the subway in Kadıköy. A picture, shall we say, of this world of kind of media kitsch that was utterly disposable in the 70s and the 80s, but now, of course, is highly collectible and highly commoditized. So here we are in a rather chic kind of flea markety kind of place, again in Balat. The world of arabesque, as I want to keep on stressing, is a world of film, actually, just as much as music. A world of a kind of complicated, exoticized, eroticized relationship with the Arab world, and all leading to the question which my flaneur-like wanderings supported, which is, where has it gone? Now, I would say the history of arabesque has always been a history of disappearance. It's never been there. You know, wherever you look for it, wherever you went to look for it, there would be somebody to tell you it's somewhere else, or you've arrived too late. You know, if only you'd been here 5 years ago, you would have seen it. And I think in my experience, this story goes at least back to the 1980s. People were saying, no, you should have been here earlier. You've kind of missed it. So it's also of interest to me, I think, that this idea that arabesque has this ghost-like kind of presence in contemporary Turkish culture. You kind of reach out to touch it, but it just sort of melts when you do. And nowhere was this more clear, and this became, a rather significant part of the film, than in the İmeçe, which some of you may know. So it's a big wholesale market in the old part of the city, which in the 1980s, right up into the mid-1990s, was basically the cassette and CD market that was really the sort of infrastructure for arabesque as a kind of cultural industry, as a kind of music industry in those years. So when I was doing my research, if I couldn't think of anything else to do, or if I didn't have anything else planned, I would simply go down there. This is 1984, 1985, 1986, and easily find someone to talk to, somebody with time on their hands, and just learn a ton of interesting things and make all sorts of new connections and just see the world of arabesque, as it were, sort of taking shape. As many of you will know, İmeçe is now empty in a rather haunted kind of way. So Seyfettin Tokmak was very, what he wanted to end the film with, and it ended up getting cut quite a lot, was pictures of me wandering around in the semi-darkness, in this deserted space that, of course, I'd remembered as just being full of people and full of activity, wondering where it's all gone. It's not completely empty. Vural Şahin, who is a noted arabesque poet and producer, defiantly maintains an office up on the top floor, signified by all of the potted plants, which he, to the best of my knowledge, still inhabits in glorious kind of hermit-like isolation. And his little office has become a kind of shrine to the arabesque of the 1980s and the 1990s. He worked very closely, as some of you may know, with Orhan Gencebay. The other great use for the İmeçe these days is if you want to make a gritty policier, and you need a big, bleak-looking empty space to film shootouts and all sorts of gangsterish things, this is the place that you go. So when we went to actually make our film there, we had to wait for something like 2 hours for another film crew who were filming some kind of shootout scene up on the top floor. So if you do see the film and get all the way through to the last bit of it, what you see on the screen there is what I was looking at about an hour before I actually shot that very last scene. So there we are. And also, as I was saying, one of the things that this recent iteration of the kind of academic intellectual gaze on arabesque recapitulates is the need for talking heads. Talking heads from outside, talking heads from above, talking heads from below, talking heads from within. So there we see my good friend Martin Grever, a wonderful source of knowledge on all sorts of Turkish things, and particularly German Turkish things. Murat Belge, of course, and Burhan Bayar, songwriter and composer who has who had many interesting and important things to say. So that's this gave me an excuse or a kind of impetus to be thinking about arabesque not just as a kind of popular cultural practice, but as a field of inquiry, concern, anxiety, an academic endeavor. So if I'm to reflect on how my own kind of engagement with this has been over the years, I would arrange things in a triptych, and the central panel of a triptych, the biggest, of course, is one that would be framed by Turkey's, let me just call it the long 1980s, sort of meaning, I suppose, mid-70s, the run-up to the 1980 coup, through into the 1990s, and sort of up to the period of the rise of Refah and the AKP. So this is what I mean by the long 1980s. This was a period in which arabesque was widely understood to have been banned by the authorities, but that's never really was the case. Rather, it was marginalized, often by ruse rather than diktat from the official media, but it was kind of everywhere. It was understood as vulgar, as a music associated with the southeast of the country, of the music associated with rural-urban migration, for music that was very much associated with urban poverty of one kind or another, whether city central or whether peripheral, which is to say associated with the squatter towns that were being built well, from the 1950s onwards, but with particular intensity in the 1970s, the so-called Gecekondu. It was a music that one was constantly told was a kind of vernacularized version of how Anatolian people heard Egyptian music, which was considered from above as being very problematic. It was considered to be anti-modern in some sense. It was considered to be a troubling picture of a failure of the country to modernize and develop in certain kinds of ways. Above all, it was a kind of embarrassment. It was an embarrassment because people secretly loved it. I mean, this is how embarrassment works, isn't it? You know you shouldn't, but you're drawn to it somehow. And so this is a way of describing, very crudely, a kind of cultural condition. This was to change in the 1990s, and for various reasons. So let's just think of the Özal years, the Dalan years, a moment of kind of emergence from authoritarian rule, a moment of political and economic transformation, a moment of kind of liberalization, a word I use with immense caution. But it took the form of Özal declaring that he spoke for the marginalized, for the people from the southeast of the country in particular. And this then took the form of kind of statements that seemed to be affirmative of arabesque, kind of, I understand you guys. And that this then had the knock-on effect in the Turkish radio and television of just opening the doors to arabesque, just maybe a crack, so various kind of designated people, Orhan Gencebay, who I'll get to in a moment, could kind of sneak in and kind of make their presence felt. So arabesque became the sign of a certain kind of change, and it became a moment at which serious heavyweight intellectuals started to, quote unquote, take it seriously. In other words, start writing books and articles about it, interviewing big arabesque names. So people like Murat Belge, Nedim Karakayalı, Meral Özbek, started writing about arabesque in a way that was sympathetic and engaged, looking for something to say about what this might actually mean, rather than just dismissing it as a kind of broken, polluted yoz culture. The 1980s was quite another time, and one only has to look at these pictures that I took in the early 1980s to realize that half a century ago, this really is almost an archaeological exercise of remembering and imagining an Istanbul which no longer exists. I mean, these are the kind of topoi of the arabesque world, the kind of derelict inner cities. This is Balat on the left, of course, vastly transformed today. Can anybody remember what Topkapı used to look like? in the 1980s with these just sort of these blue minibuses in every single direction. Can anybody remember what Kavacık used to look like, which is now just skyscrapers as far as the eye can see? And this was Kavacık, a sort of single-story gecekondu building slowly being kind of bulldozed or just brushed aside for incipient kind of high-rise building. I think I took these pictures in 1990, probably, kind of quite late in the day. But believe it or not, that's Kavacık. My engagement with this world as a kind of faux naive engagement just always started off with the premise, what if we think about this as music? You know, what if we just try and get inside the musical beat and pulse and groove and timbre of this music? What if we were just to sort of put aside all of the anxieties about whether this is good Turkish culture or bad Turkish culture, or whether it's leading the country in this direction or another direction, and just locate the musos, locate the people who just want to talk about instruments, about composition, about songs, about lyrics, about maqams, about techniques, about what they do in the studio. What would the picture look like if we started to talk to, as it were, these kind of people rather than the designated talking heads? So that was very much my method, if you want. And another facet of this, just being prepared to spend some time with arabesque songs and arabesque films, rather than constantly looking through them to try and find something else, sort of crack the code which might reveal what it might say about class or resistance or things like that, but just to sort of dwell, as it were, on the surface of things. So for those of you who either want a little blast of nostalgia, or for those of you who might be very unfamiliar with arabesque, I could think of nothing better to do than spend 5 minutes talking about one song, an iconic song, 1975, Orhan Gencebay's Batsın Bu Dünya. It was located in a film. Please remember that I always want to stress that this is film. The world of arabesque is as much film as it is music. The film was directed by Osman Seden. Scenario Erdoğan Tunaş. It came from a story by someone called Vedat Türk Ali. It starred Orhan Gencebay and Müjde Ar. The song and the lyrics were by Orhan Gencebay. Orhan Gencebay in those days tended to write everything, all of his own stuff himself. The lyrics, this is my translation, Batsın Bu Dünya, a pity that fate should do such a thing. Everything is darkness. Where is humanity? Shame on those who make a slave of the slave. A curse on the world. May this dream end. Shame on those who laugh and make others cry. Do I have to suffer yet unborn trials, yet unlived torments? This is the arabesque world in microcosm, actually, a world neatly divided in halves between those who oppress and those who are oppressed. A world of people who the haves and the have-nots. A world of moral indignation that this should be the state of affairs. A world of laughter and tears. A world of anxiety about fate. Of what is to come, and something kind of evasively political about this, something subtly and evasively about, what I'm talking about here, okay? Which in the air that people were breathing in the 1970s and in the 1980s was perceptible. It was felt. Always to be sidestepped by Orhan Gencebay, who would keep on saying, and said when I eventually managed to find him and he treated me to a long and generous interview, his motif always was, it's not about politics, it's about love. And I'm going to come back to this right at the end. Orhan Gencebay, I wonder whether I need to say anything about him to anybody in this room. A kind of iconic, organic arabesque intellectual, in the sense that he was, even in the 1980s, very kind of articulate and vocal about what was going on in the world of Turkish music. Somebody who's associated with arabesque, but his training, he grew up in Samsun. He was taught music by somebody called Emin Tarakçı, who was a Crimean refugee, and he was taught Western music. So actually his first training was in Western music. He kind of moved around the space of Western music, Turkish classical music, Turkish pop, jazz, actually as well. Apparently, I think it was when he went to Edirne to live, he became kind of quite interested in jazz. I always love this picture because he did pick up the sitar at one point when sitars were kind of knocking around in Istanbul, and people were bringing them back from their journeys to Kathmandu and India and what have you. And he picked it up, and it was part of the soundtrack of the time, as of course Indian cinema was as well. The film, Batsun Bu Dünya, was a kind of revenge fantasy. The poor man, Orhan, is made to carry the blame for an assault and a rape, which leads pregnant the character that Müjde Ar plays, a rap that he is obliged to absorb because he has no other choice. But the perpetrators, the rich man in the village and his loutish sons, just continue to behave horribly and oppressively to the characters played by Orhan Gencebay and Müjde Ar. And in the end, Orhan finally snaps, goes off on a revenge mission, and then the final scenes of the film are him driving his boat, because I won't bother you with all of the details, but the story is that he's a motorboat driver with the son of the villain kind of hanging from the yardarm. So it's a kind of gruesome kitsch revenge fantasy, and the song is this. Let's listen to it.
Yazıklar olsun, yazıklar olsun, kaderin böylesine yazıklar olsun. Her şey karanlık, nerede insanlık, kula kulluk edene yazıklar olsun. Batsın bu dünya, bitsin bu rüya, ağlatıp da gülene yazıklar olsun. Doğmamış çileler, yaşanmamış dertler, hasret çeken gönül benim mi olsun? Ben ne yaptım, kader sana mahkum ettin beni bana. Her nefeste bin sitem var, şikayetim Yaradan'a, şikayetim Yaradan'a. Şaşıran sen mi yoksa ben miyim bilemedim. Öyle bir dert verdin ki kendime gelemedim. Çıkmaz bir sokaktayım, yolumu bulamadım. Of of of of of of of of of.
that's halfway, that's half of the song, and then the second half repeats it more or less exactly. There's already quite a lot going on there. Now, people like me, sort of confronted with the task of just making sense of this, sort of figuring out what all the building blocks of this are, tend to do various things. One is find the people who made it and just ask them about it. What was involved in putting all of this together? What's involved in just the making of this music? And that's, you know, can be quite a story. We try and teach ourselves the various instruments, and of course we come to this perhaps as musicians ourselves, so we know a little bit about, you know, what to do with hands and fingers and musical phrases and so on and so forth. And perhaps we might even try and reconstruct this, because only in the process of reconstructing it do you discover things that you didn't realize that you did know, as well as discover the things that you didn't know, which then serve as a bunch of questions that in an ideal world you can take back to the people who are more directly associated with the making of this music and ask them, you know, I found this difficult, or I found this complicated, or I just didn't quite see how that worked. This worked. Can you explain it to me? So to the extent that I had a method, that was kind of my method. And what comes out of that is a picture of this as, yes, popular cultural, yes, hitch in certain ways, yes, kind of music that doesn't make kind of great claims for itself, but nonetheless something that has been put together intricately with care, and a lot of skill and intelligence. And if I was just to try and sum up, you know, what I'm hearing in this, just at the level of musical kind of design and construction, I'm hearing something which is polystylistic. So we've got something that sounds vaguely Egyptian style strings. We've got something that sounds a little bit 1970s pop rock, perhaps even a little bit progressive rock. We've got some flamenco in there. We've got something that sounds rather folky with the electro saz there. We've got dum dum da da dum dum da. We've got the whole Çiftetelli kind of dance moves in there. So one thing I'm noticing here is that it's kind of polystylistic, we might say. Another thing I'm noticing is that these things don't follow one another in some sort of orderly pattern, but they're kind of interruptive. You know, you get going on something and then something else interrupts, and oh, it's the flamenco guitar, and oh, it's the electro sax. Oh, no, he's singing now, and now we're on to something else. So this sort of helter-skelter kind of interruptive nature thing is very much part of the aesthetic. Another thing I'm figuring out here is that we're partly in the world of makam, which is to say the kind of modal structures of Turkish art music and Turkish folk music in particular. So a way of thinking melodically in terms of certain kind of conventional shapes and frames and structures, which is in the world of Turkish music is elaborate and sophisticated and kind of huge. And somebody like Orhan Gencebay, you know, really knows this stuff in quite a lot of detail. So I'm hearing that being fitted together with something that is about the movement of chords that you might play on a keyboard or on a guitar. Okay, in ways that those of us familiar with Western popular music are kind of sort of think with it instinctively. But what makes this kind of fascinating is the way in which these are kind of connected and kind of hybridize one another. Another thing that interests me here is we're in a motivic world, and I'm more interested now than I used to be in how this works in these films. So this song provides the motivic elements associated with particular characters, not dissimilar to Wagnerian opera. So yam ya da da dum is a motif that is continually associated with the Müjde Ar character, Seher. The Çiftetelli motif is part of the story of this of the kind of soundscape of this film all the way through, signifying kind of threat and danger and so on and so forth. So we're in a world which has been constructed to produce motifs that have a kind of poetic and a dramatic function in the course of a particular kind of narrative. Now, the picture that this leaves me within this particular frame is the conclusions that I found myself drawing from this particular framing, this particular exercise, go as follows. One is that this music has everything to do with the Turkish mediascape and soundscape, and practically nothing to do with the Arab world. Secondly, that this music is this musical space is so diverse and so complex that it just doesn't make any sense to talk about this as in conventional terms as a kind of genre. Rather, it's a kind of discursive space. It's a way of talking about what music should be and conversely what music shouldn't be. I also came to the conclusion that we have to understand this as a kind of mediatic space, and particularly a kind of media slippage, if you will, between the world of LPs and cassettes and CDs, between the world of cinema, film, and Betamax videos, between the worlds of deregulated radio, thinking about the 1990s, to digital worlds, now to streaming worlds. I think one of the ways to grasp arabesque is in the kind of slippage between these kind of spaces, which don't make sense in terms of the conventional narratives that are habitually told in media studies about how certain media formats follow one another: 78s, 45s, 33 RPM, cassettes, CDs, and so on and so forth. What's going on here significantly complicates that kind of picture. It's difficult to grasp, but I think an attempt to do so helps one understand how arabesque moves around this kind of media space. And finally, this frame leaves one thinking about how one might try and grasp this politically in a world in which the exponents of this music are constantly refusing that question. It's not about politics, it's about love. But nonetheless, we're talking about the mediation of, or the transformations between certain kinds of cultures of authoritarianism on the one hand, and certain kind of cultures of democracy or democratic feeling on the other. So I'll just give myself a little pause for a bit of water. I decided not to script myself, which gives me, which I think helps me just manage my timing a little bit, and perhaps I'm going to move in accordance with my triptych metaphor here. So that's the big central panel. So the two side panels, in a way, I want to talk about a little bit more quickly. I think the picture of how we might think about arabesque has been hugely transformed over the last 20 years by the enormous amount of work that's been done on Ottoman and early Republican social and cultural histories. And this is why it's important. One story told about arabesque is a story of reaction. So the late Ottoman state and the early Republican state were deeply committed to a kind of cultural policy of the arts that was very invested in kind of top-down thinking, in the construction of the big institutions, the big Western music institutions in Ankara, in particular the Western composers, the Bartoks, the Hindemids, the Marxes were all bought in to instigate a program of Western music teaching. Or in Istanbul, conversely, where very much in this way of institutions that were devoted to the idea of a kind of modernized and westernized form of the traditional practice. And to use the media, to use the emerging media as a means of kind of imposing this should we say, on the Turkish population. So a very conventional narrative about arabesque, and one that is still very kind of sticky, is that this reform process was heavy-handed, it was bureaucratic, it was insensitive, it trusted too much in top-down mechanisms, it didn't really have a sufficiently sophisticated understanding or feel for the people who were supposed to be the beneficiaries or otherwise of this music. And the story goes, of course it was going to fail. Of course people were going to be turned off by what was demanded of them culturally. Of course they were going to reach in their radio sets for what was more familiar and close to home, or what just sounded somehow closer to them. And one of these things being Egyptian radio, which was being blasted out of Nasser's Cairo in the 1950s at a very high kilowattage. So this is a kind of conventional story, again, a rather sort of Turkey, Anatolian-centric picture of how arabesque came to be arabesque. And I think everything that I'm just going to summarize over the next 5 minutes, I think really casts that into doubt and suggests much broader and more productive frameworks for thinking about this. So another kind of dimension of this institution building was, look, it's much easier to know what you're against rather than what you're for. And the music form reforms were kind of quite incoherent, really, from the get-go. People weren't really sure whether they wanted this or whether they wanted that. Are we going to westernize? Are we going to polyphonicize? Are we going to find kind of modern and up-to-date ways of embedding the traditional culture? And if the traditional culture, which traditional culture? Folk music, the urban music, what exactly? Okay, so you've got all of this incoherence. And if you don't know what it is that you want, it might be that you know what you don't want. So it's an interesting story to be told here about how the idea of Arab music comes to kind of stand for everything that we don't want. One way of tracing this is to look at the sort of top-down way of looking at this is to think about Mustafa Kemal's speech on the 10th of August of 1928, delivered at the Sarayburnu Gazinosu in Gülhane. In the aftermath of, the details are not a little bit lost in myth and obscurity, a performance by the great Egyptian singer Munira al-Mahdaya. I don't know if anybody knows Munira al-Mahdaya, but she was the kind of counterweight to Kulthum. As Kulthum rose in Egypt, Munira al-Mahdaya kind of sank. But Munira al-Mahdaya had a great, was very popular all around the Eastern Mediterranean. Here she was in Istanbul giving a concert. There was Mustafa Kemal listening. And again, the story goes, coming to sort of deep conclusions about the kind of emotional tonality of the revolution, of the kind of Western-oriented secular revolution, and of the performance, reflecting on the fact that the local audiences kind of clearly liked Munira al-Mahdaya, but couldn't really understand it, and that when something more a more Western-style band, a more alla franga band took the stage, that there was kind of more interest. He said this was quite natural. In truth, the Turks are essentially joyous and vivacious. If ever this beautiful character were to be altered at any time, it would not be done by them. Sorrow, huzun, is the result of calamitous events. Not to perceive this difference between alla franga and Ataturk music is intolerable. Behold, the Turkish nation amends the bloody mistakes of its policies. The worries of the Turkish people vanish, and the Turks are once again happy. By nature, Turks are cheerful, because the true Turkish spirit does not relish in that state which has so disturbed its memory. The maintenance of this predicament must continue to be a desirous goal. So the transformation of Turkish society as kind of mood, sort of emotion management, it's kind of mood management, is very striking in this particular passage. So what's changing the picture here is the research that's going on into the Darul Elhan, and in particular its sound archival projects. This is particularly interesting. The Darul Elhan was the Ottoman conservatory system, which survived in altered form into the early years of the Republic. It was the gathering place of a generation of kind of music intellectuals who set out to notate the classics that they considered to be important to musical cultural heritage. What has been neglected in this story, and there's an interesting story about what happened to these recordings with their sound recordings, which for the most part have sat gathering dust on shelves. They've found their way back to Istanbul University, and there you see Ulaş Özdemir, who's now curating this collection. And what one can already say about the sound recordings as opposed to the written documents is that they betray a much more tangled and cosmopolitan space, a space that is much harder to parse in terms of urban or rural and kind of legitimate or not so legitimate than we would otherwise think. This kind of research, thanks to digitization and all of the tools at our disposal these days, is now progressing beautifully thanks to people like Ulaş Özdemir. The world of study into, let's just call it the music industry or the world of music commodities. Late in the 19th century, early in the 20th century, music notations, the trade in music notations, things to bring back home to play on the piano was, these were important objects of commerce, beautiful objects of commerce as well. This gives us a picture of things quite remote from the world of the conservatories and the academies. And only now, thanks to people like Gönül Paçacı, are we getting some kind of perspective on that. Thirdly, the world of sound recording, thanks to the work of Cemal Ünlü, the long history of sound recording from wax cylinders onwards is now coming into perspective. This is a world that confounds any nationalist attempt to read the media space. It's to understand it at all, one has to understand singing and sound recording in Armenian and in Greek and in Ladino. And the research that is being done on this by various people, Aradinkjian, Cemal Ünlü, and many others, gives us a picture of a very cosmopolitan space. And again, one that sort of confounds this kind of inner box grasp of the cultural politics of late Ottoman and early Turkish Republican worlds that we've had up to now. This hugely interests me. So with the Tekke Ilgası of 1925, the Sufi lodges were all closed by order, as you will well know. So all of the huge musical traditions associated with this world went underground. They disappeared, and all of the archives associated with it went underground. Only in very recent years are these archives coming back into focus. What's interesting about the left-hand one here is that this is a genre called shugul. So it's been notated sometime in the 1940s. So notice the Arabic script is still being used in the 1940s. And this is a recording of a kind of Arabic language devotional practice, kind of Sufi practice, that was kind of cultivated during Abdul Hamid's effort to kind of create a kind of cosmopolitan and kind of Arab-oriented Ottoman space. So one could say, many people actually have said this was the first Arabesk. Make of that what you will. So these archives associated with Sufism are, again, only recently, and thanks to the work of people like my friend and colleague Harun Korkmaz, coming into view. Here we have a picture of the Fevziye Kıraathanesi in Şehzadebaşı. So this was where the Muslim memur, kind of administrative classes, used to gather after work before they got on public transport and went back home. It was also the site of late Hamidian Ramazan festivities, which were being bigged up as a way of sort of bolstering the support of that particular class late in the 19th century. There's a lot of documentation here from the newspapers, which give us a picture of musicking from all over the Ottoman Empire, and particularly the Arab world as well. The Fevziye Kıraathanesi was turned into a kind of university, a kind of conservatory for a kind of public-oriented kind of version of Fasıl. So thanks to the work of Onur Güneş Ayaş and a team of people at Yıldız University working on the social history of the Şehzadebaşı area, this comes into view. Finally, the world of the minority, the Armenian music theorists is coming into view. Again, there's a very sort of convenient and simple picture that is being told here about the invention of a music notation system, which was widely used in the Ottoman world by Armenian theorists. This is very much understood in terms of a kind of transactional set of relationships between the Armenian communities and the Sultan. Whereas, in fact, as Jacob Oli shows in some remarkable work on this subject, so much of this actually comes out of Venice and the Mehtarist movement there, which was really a kind of Ottoman engagement with the world of Enlightenment music theory, and particularly the world of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And this very important treatise by Minas Bezishkian of 1812, absolutely central to the kind of stabilizing of this system of music notation, it really needs to be understood to understand the kind of social and intellectual context of late Ottoman world music making. So and then one final thing here is this is perhaps a world in which I've been more engaged than others, is the world of Ottoman connections and legacies in the Arab world. This has been entirely ignored. And the role of kind of mediating figures like Sami Shawa from Aleppo, a huge media star in Egypt, sort of fashioned a kind of an instrumental practice oriented to the media of the time in the 1920s and the 1930s in particular, played a very important role in mediating Ottoman practices and Ottoman repertoires and popularizing them around the Arab world. So research on this, so this wonderful book based on his memoirs has been written by Ahmed Eselhi, who you can see playing the violin there, yours truly playing the kanun. And on the right there, Tariq Bashir. This is just a handful of people from a community of 20 or 30 people around Lebanon and around Egypt, who really are sort of devoting themselves to kind of thinking about these Ottoman connections, thinking by playing, as you can see. I'm going to wrap up really quickly, and my third triptych is going to be super quick. But just to conclude that last section, really what I want to say here is that a habit of thinking about kind of music politics, vernacular music making in Turkey, it's no longer possible to think about this sort of trapped within the rectangular boundaries of the nation state. I think everything that's happening in this beautifully lively field at the moment encourages us to think about much broader spaces, much more cosmopolitan spaces, much more interconnected spaces around the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Now, this brings me to my last point, which I'll speed through super quickly. Over the years, I keep on encountering things and finding myself thinking, that's the way they're talking about that really sounds like arabesque. The Greeks, as always, have a word for it, skiladiko, which means dog music. It doesn't really point to anything except the music of the lowest common denominator, the music of poor taste, the music that people don't really want to listen to, the music that people dance to at weddings, but otherwise think absolutely terrible. I was going to play an example of the island version of this skiladiko nisiotiko, which I was subjected to with a friend at a wedding recently in the tiniest of villages where we'd gone to recuperate after a long conference, and the noise was deafening. It wasn't just intended to deafen the village, but all of the neighboring villages, and probably be heard in Turkey as well. Everybody woke up the next morning complaining about it. And yeah, what do you expect? Dog music. It was, I thought, there's, my word, how like arabesque. Chalga in Bulgaria. Rai in North Africa. Rabis, the Armenian arabesque. Turbo folk in the former Yugoslavia. Manele in Romania. Urban Sha'bi and its offspring, Mahraganat in Cairo. Dangdut in Indonesia. What binds and connects these things? Certain habits of listening, certain mediascapes, certain musical instruments. Roma, of course, who connect these worlds in all sorts of very interesting and powerful ways, particularly across the Balkans. There's a connection. I can't resist just playing a little. Schiletico Nisiotico, which kept me awake between about 11 o'clock one night and about 6 o'clock the next morning, without stopping, and as far as I could make out, the same 5 songs over and over and over. Are any conclusions possible from this kind of frame, a kind of cross-cultural frame? I'm not sure that there are, but I want to just finish by suggesting that these all taken together give us something to think about in terms of the soundscapes, authoritarian and democratic traditions in these spaces. They give us some material to think about various kinds of transitions from X to the markets, the sort of crazy market economies that we're all trapped in at the moment, and the emergence of particular social classes, you know, associated with this kind of wedding kind of music, sort of display and largesse. Do they have something in common to tell us about these kind of histories of kind of media slippage, these kind of sideways sliding movements between different kind of media apparatuses, perhaps? And finally, do they have anything to tell us about the role that music plays in ongoing, emergent, continually developing discourses about civility and love? And when our interlocutors tell us it's not about politics, actually it's about love, maybe there's more of a clue there than we might be prepared to accept at the outset. So there, I'll leave it. It indicates, I want to try and indicate some of the shifting frames within which we might look at arabesque, some of the shifting frames within which I've looked at arabesque, some kind of sense of why I find it compelling. I keep coming back to it. I've written 2 books on the subject already, and I've got to say, I'm afraid to say, I think I've got a 3rd one in me. Maybe, we'll see. Thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you.
I mentioned in my introduction how the British Academy wanted us to extend our disciplinary range. And I think we've been privileged in being aware of the extraordinary range of how musicologists can work, ethnomusicology, whether it's just musicology, I think, with a anthropological spin, but and it's not just anthropology, it's the sociology and the contemporary world of Turkey and cultural history. I thought that was and it just gave us such a privilege to be able to understand the different ways of approaching the way that people make music and what it means to them in different settings. And some of their settings were great. I mean, I remember Topkapi, the bus station there. I think it was one of the. I used to inflict it on my children when we went up to the Black Sea. It was my wife hasn't recovered. Anyway, can I ask? Thank Martin very much, and I hope we have some time for questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the beautiful talk. Would you maybe talk about a little about how Arabesk trickled down to the pop singers or Anatolian rock singers in the late 80s, whereas they were maybe educated or performing Anatolian rock and roll, psychedelic music. We see even the marginal figures like Erkin Koray slowly changing into Arabeskish influences.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. In the 70s and 80s, the world of, say, Anatolian pop and Anatolian rock and Arabesk were kind of miles apart. There was a transformation that I would associate kind of with CDs and digitization, a kind of rather media, a sort of tech-driven set of transformations, which I think brought pop and Arabesk kind of quite close together. Think of sort of Sezen Aksu around that particular kind of moment. Then what happens is that Turkey just goes through all sorts of vast changes. And this whole era starts to look like yesterday. You know, it starts to look like the past. At which point Arabesk becomes a nostalgic topic, which kind of makes it available, I think, for all sorts of people. So that, again, I think sort of draws kind of interesting, kind of experimental and rocky and all sorts of sort of thoughtful people kind of back into this space. And I think at the moment, Arabesk is really kind of living in a way in that sort of nostalgic space in which that proximity between kind of experimental and rock worlds and Arabesk is well, it's much closer than I think than you could ever imagined that it would be back in the 1980s and the 1990s. It's a very interesting story, yeah. Please.
When Meral Özbek was writing about Arabesk and how its subject changed from an kind of unknown, unidentified lover in for instance, Batsın Bu Dünya, like the person is in love with someone but can't find reciprocity for his love. And then later this changing with figures like Ibrahim Tatlıses's changing, I want to kiss you, you know, like a more maybe tangible love. So is the Arabesque's subject or issues they are dealing with change throughout the years as well?
I don't know how many people are familiar with the wonderful work of a great Ottoman's scholar of poetry, Walter Andrews, and he wrote a tiny paper which you'll have to look quite hard to find about Orhan Gencebay as the last Ottoman poet. And he makes a very convincing case, actually, for kind of the early world of Orhan Gencebay is very much inhabiting the world of ghazal poetics with this kind of remote, manipulative, pain-inflicting, always absent lover. The sort of masochistic quality of this kind of verse, and I think I think that's an accurate picture, actually, of the world that Orhan Gencebay kind of both inhabited and created for himself. And as Arabesk became kind of drawn into the cultural mainstream, it's as many commentators noted it, the love object started to subtly change and become more present, more pleasure-giving and affirming, a kind of more generative of a kind of ethos of partying and pleasure taking. And it's a way of thinking about the transformation in that particular moment, which people like Meral Özbek, who wrote this, wrote the first book on Arabesk, and a very fine, deeply scholarly piece of work it was too. This was an important topic for her, and I think she dealt with it beautifully.
Thank you, Martin. That was wonderful. I'm really speaking for ignorance, but when I first saw the title of your presentation, I thought, is it we're going to have to choose between Ferdi Tayfur, Müslüm Gürses, or when you think of Orhan Gencebay. In Turkey, they ask you if you sing Arabesk, which one are you? Do you support one or of these three? And that was not the triptych, so I was happy to see that your presentation turned out otherwise. My question has to do with, based on this sort of Turkish triptych of Arabesque singers, how do you place any sort of sociological, developmental comments that you might have in relationship to the ethnic politics of Arabesk and Ibrahim Tatlıses's place in this? Because in the triptych, you're not allowed to have a fourth person. It's interesting in that respect.
It's yes. Orhan Gencebay, Ferdi Tayfur, Müslüm Gürses. This would be a trilogy rather than a triptych, I suppose, or a trinity, perhaps. It's definitely the case that commentary on the world of Arabesque, almost inevitably takes a rather kind of Orhan Gencebay kind of route. But I think the best. So I did allude, either cagily or foolishly, to another book project actually, and at some point in the 1980s, a great singer and very interesting man, Mustafa Keser, pulled me aside and said, "Come and meet me, we must talk." So I went to his offices and we sat down for a chat. So Mustafa Keser was just becoming famous in the 1980s, so sort of flirting with Arabesque, but he ended up doing a rather different kind of, he's a very well-known character. And he said, "You know what you need to do?" He said, you need to go to Southeast Anatolia. And I tell you why. He says, "You need to go to Horput Elazığ." So this was one of the old Southeastern Anatolian cities that has got this great, deep tradition of urban music making. Not folk music, not Istanbul, şarkı, but their own stuff. And I remember he said, "You go there," he said, "all of your questions will be answered." Never forgot that. I stayed in touch with him over the years, and then a few years ago, I saw him in his nightclub. He's still going strong, age, like late 80s, I guess, at this particular point. And I said, eventually that happened, just before the lockdown. So he's from Mardin. He's a Zazaki-speaking father, I think I've got it right, and a Kurmanji-speaking mother. Absolute virtuoso of just Turkish folk music, Turkish classical music, of all of the different Kurdish songs and practices, much else besides. It's a phenomenal kind of mind. And what he wanted me to see was not, this isn't a story about it. Well, it was all Kurdish and they sort of ripped it off kind of thing. But there is a world in the Southeast of deeply historically rooted, highly sophisticated music making, in which you've got all sorts of things at play. Armenian legacy, various Kurdish song practices, various different Turkish practices, all sorts of things drifting up the Euphrates from Baghdad, all sorts of soundscapes coming from Iran. And it was a brilliant piece of advice, and he was absolutely right. I won't say all of my questions have been answered, but this gives you a very, very different picture, actually, about the relationship between these things, you know, that we call song traditions and these things that we call ethnicities, which are a very, very complex issue, as of course we all know. These things don't sort of map onto one another in any easy shape or form. But he wanted me to kind of grasp that southeastern Anatolian musical cosmopolitanism. And, you know, he wanted me to understand that this thing that we were calling arabesque in the 1980s has really got some connection with that. So that's the best answer I can give you. And actually, I do think it's a good answer. And I think Mustafa Keser was right. Yes, sir.
I'll be quick. I'll be quick. Yes, thank you. That was wonderful. No, I mean, what about Orhan Gencebay's Western music education? I mean, at the time, which years was this in the, I can't even think how old he must be now. Is he still? I can't remember.
He's getting on a bit now. So this would.
So, I mean, was this something that people, I don't know anything about his family. I mean, we just knew, you know, there was arabesque all around us and we knew about him, but we didn't much think about his background. Probably you knew Asla and people. But was this something that people in families like him would have pushed their children to do that? And what traces did it leave in his arabesque and the other people like him who might have had the same education, the other big names?
Yeah, so for people of his generation, music was certainly, it was possible to think of music as being respectable, which hasn't always historically been the case. It helps if you're a man rather than a woman. So, you know, it's a gendered story, certainly. I think he grew up in a world in which what we might call Western music and Anatolian and other Mediterranean and Eastern musics mingled, I think, much less self-consciously than they were later to do. So one approached them as music rather than as this kind of music and that kind of music. It was a world of relative media surplus, not surplus, but plenty rather than paucity, as I would have said the case was in the 1980s. You know, you could get hold of recordings, you could listen to things, you could kind of give yourself a bit of a music education. And then you have the interesting phenomenon, which still goes on, by the way, of Western musical education coming into the country from Bulgaria, from the former Soviet Union, from conservatory-trained graduates who had relocated for whatever reason or found refuge in Turkey and were plying their trade as very good, clearly very good music teachers. So it's a story about Samsun as well, which is where he's from, which I suspect had got its own particular kind of trajectory. I don't know how much one can generalize from this, but that's as much as one can say, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And the questions have all demonstrated the sort of the wealth of what you've given us. So thank you. Thank you again.